Well, I want you to turn in your Bible to 1 Samuel chapter 30. And I want you to go to this section because I'm going to talk about this morning how we can have our souls strengthened. I've titled this Strength for the Distressed Soul. And that comes from our section here in 1 Samuel 30. And we'll kind of get to this text here in a minute, but I want to give you some degree of background as to, before we even get here in this chapter, what has happened in David's life before all of this. Little background of what's happened with David. So before we get to 30, back in chapter 16, David is anointed king. And then in 17, he has that battle with Goliath where he defeats him. And then in chapter 21 of 1 Samuel begins David's flee for his life. And he's fleeing for his life from Saul, who has this bitter, raging jealousy against David. And so David has to flee for his life. And then this goes on for years. For years, this is what David's life is consumed with, fleeing for his life. During this time period, he actually ends up sparing Saul's life twice. And then after some years pass, David is forced to actually go and live amongst the Philistines, which is, of course, God's people's enemies. These were people outside of Israel, and they were the greatest enemies of Israel. And David is forced, because of Saul's jealousy, to flee and go and live amongst the Philistines. And by the time we actually get to chapter 30, you have this Philistine king who's named Achish, and he says about David that David has been with him now for days and years. So years have gone past where David is running about in the wilderness outside of the covenant community of Israel. This has been David's life for years up until this point. And of course, it would have been a pretty severe affliction upon David. We know that many of David's psalms do come from this period, but I wouldn't doubt that many that we don't know for sure came from this period, maybe did come from this time period. Just listen to a few words here. Psalm 6, I am weary with my moanings. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with weeping. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows weak because of all my foes. Psalm 13, how long, O Yahweh, will you forget me? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? And this kind of idea is all through the Psalms of David. And so as David faces this trial, again, I wouldn't doubt that much of what he says about his sufferings comes from this period. And even before we get to chapter 30 of 1 Samuel, this is a man who has faced a great degree of isolation and discouragement. But there's something that's important that I want you to know. Even in this trial of David's exile, as he's out in the wilderness away from God's people, even in that trial of exile, not all hope is lost for him. Because even here, there are many people that are still with David. There's many people that still stand with him. Now, I don't know how many, but we do see later on in our text in 1 Samuel 30 that David ends up going off with 600 men. So even though in this time period, over this course of several years, even though David has been pushed further and further away from God and further away from God's people, he still has cause for encouragement at this point. Because men and women and families, they stand by David's side in support. But what we'll see in this text in chapter 30 is that even these people that were left are going to be removed from David's support and encouragement. And so it brings us to here in chapter 30. All that sort of work up. What has David been experiencing up until this point? And then just before chapter 30, David, he tries to go out to battle with the Philistines. And the king of the Philistines sends him back home. He says, go back home. We don't want you here with us in battle. And so he's sent back home. And then we're going to pick up the story here starting in chapter 30 in verse 1. So look with me at this. Now, when David and his men came to Ziklag, that's where David's camp was. So when he leaves Ziklag, he goes out to battle, to go out to battle with the Philistines. He's sent back home. So now they're returning back to where David's encampment is. When David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taking captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. So here is David's present situation. These people have encountered a truly horrifying situation, right? They've come home to find not only are their houses burned and everything they had burned up and destroyed by this invading band of people, but even worse, everything that they hold dear, their wives and their children, have been taken off as captives. And brethren, you can imagine, if you imagine the scene as David and his group of men, they come back and they come over the hill and they see there their encampment that is on fire and everything is gone. And undoubtedly, brethren, it would have caused their hearts to absolutely sink with grief to know what has just taken place. I mean, a parent, you guys can ask Jess about this after. She had an experience recently that I thought, this really is the only way that someone might understand this. But if you're a parent and you lose track of your child, that gives you just the slightest degree of what David and his other men likely would have felt as they came back into their camp and found their families gone, their wives and their children. And they don't know what happened to them. They don't know where they went. It would have caused their hearts to absolutely sink. But then something interesting happens in verse 6. Things take a really interesting turn here. Look at verse 6. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. This is not what I would have expected to happen in this scene. You're almost left asking, what in the world is going on here? These people have actually now turned on David. And maybe we want to ask the question, why are they doing this? This doesn't make sense. But the truth is, brethren, this kind of thing happens all too often. People can find themselves in a distressful situation. They find themselves burdened in heart, and they want somebody to blame. And it's, of course, brethren, it's always easier to look out at somebody else and to blame them for the reason why their hearts are distressed But what's even more interesting is that these people seem to forget that David himself actually shares with them in this tragedy. Right? It said in verse 5, David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Jezreel and Abigail. David is not unaffected by this situation. David is very much affected by the tragedy. But of course, it doesn't really matter to these people. Brethren, in times of tragedy and heartache, people will often forget that leaders face the same sort of pain that the other people face. Those who lead often do feel heartache just as deeply and sometimes even more so than those who don't. And yet, like David, those who lead are often the first ones that people turn to for blame. And so David finds himself caught in the crosshairs of these people, these embittered people. And that fact, too, is another interesting thing to note about these people. It says that they were embittered, or that they were bitter in soul. And what's interesting about this is that this is not the first time that these people are said to have been bitter in soul. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 22, these same people are the people that actually gather to David. They go to David, and it says because they were bitter in soul in regards to Saul's actions and Saul's leadership. So they actually come to David being bitter about Saul. And actually some translations back there in 1 Samuel 22, a few translations say that these people, they actually interchange the word of bitter in soul, and they put in there that these people were discontent. Now, maybe they had a right to be. I don't really know. I mean, there's definitely some things there that are of concern here in regards to Saul and what's happening there. But it is interesting to note, brethren, that these bitter, discontent people, in this situation, they abandon Saul to go with David, who might seem like, oh, he's a better leader. But they never really deal with the issue in their hearts. And so just as back in chapter 22, where they turn on Saul to come to David, in due time, brethren, they turn on David. And they turn away from him. And he becomes the cause of their discontentment and their bitterness. And it's interesting. I was looking into this, and I want to just share this with you because I thought the way that Matthew Henry put this is helpful. But Matthew Henry speaks about this band of people. And he says when they initially show up in chapter 22, Matthew Henry says that these people did David no great credit. He says they were not great men or even good men. They were men in distress, men in debt and discontent. They had restless spirits and did not know what to do with themselves. And then when we find him with these people again in chapter 30, Matthew Henry says that eventually these people began to despair of all that they thought they would get with David. And in this disappointment, they actually begin to threaten the life of the man that they had once committed themselves to. And Matthew Henry warns us. He says, "Oh, what absurdities will ungoverned feelings plunge us into?" But nevertheless, this is the situation where David finds himself. And brethren, there really doesn't seem to be a lot of cause for hope here. There certainly is not a lot of reason for encouragement. I mean, all the loneliness and disencouragement that David had faced in his life up until this point really couldn't even compare to where he finds himself now, because now at this point, even the people that are left, all the people that were closest to him, the only ones left with him in exile, now even those people have turned their backs on David. And the situation really echoes David's words in Psalm 55, where David says, "My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant." You can hear the similarity there, right? These people committed themselves to David. You know, I would say just a few chapters ago, but that would be years before, right? But he said that he violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. So this is David's distressful situation, brethren. And it is distressful. It's discouraging. It's disheartening. It's heartbreaking to see where David is at in this situation. And given David's situation, what takes place is absolutely astounding, brethren. And it has been a great encouragement to me. It actually says, look with me again here at verse 6, and then what comes at the end of verse 6. It says, and David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in Yahweh his God. Brethren, I don't know what you thought, what might be coming at the end of what those events were there. But that's not what I would have expected it to say next in regards to David. I would have expected maybe something more like David to run away. Maybe we would expect him to wallow in his grief, and I don't know, maybe he would eventually come out of it after a long stint of depression and a lot of counseling sessions. But that's not what happened with David. The text, brethren, is so directly to the point with what happened. David strengthened himself. And brethren, I find this so encouraging. I love the fact that the Bible actually says that this is what happened with David. It's as though this man, he looks around at his situation and he evaluates it, right? The situation is not good. The people are bitter. My own soul is in distress. My own wives and children have been taken captive. But it's like he looks at it all and goes, but somebody's got to steer this ship. We all can't just wallow in grief together. It's like David has a sense of what Peter would say later on in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13, where Peter says, "Therefore prepare your minds for action." Or the King James says, "Gird up your loins," which nobody really knows what in the world that means, but it really sounds good, right? And so the point is, in our modern language, it's time to saddle up, strap up, step up, whatever thing you want to put in there. But David is saying, Abiathar, bring me the ephod. We're going to determine what the will of God is. He's not just going to sit in this condition. And I don't know how long David was in this distressful condition before he found strength in the Lord. But I think we could take a pretty good guess at this. If you have an angry mob who's wanting to kill you, you probably don't have days or months or years to linger in that mindset. You probably had to deal with this pretty quickly. So something really extraordinary happens with David. He is able to strengthen his distressed soul. He's able to encourage his faint heart. And brethren, even the most seasoned Christians, I think, can look at what happens here in David's situation and David's response and ask, how? How did he do that? How do you do that? And so that's really what I want to consider. How can we follow David's example? How can we find strength for our distressed souls when we need it. Now, you have to remember, brethren, this situation is not normal. The situation that David finds himself in is not normal. David does not have others to help him here. He does not have Jonathan by his side like he had in the past, who could come and encourage him. It says back in chapter 23 of this same book that Jonathan rose and went to David and strengthened his hand in God. David doesn't have this right now. He doesn't have Jonathan with him. He doesn't have anyone like Aaron or Hur who were there by Moses' side to help hold his hands as he grew weary in the battle. David is really left here alone. All these other people that were with him now want to kill him. And this, brethren, is really not the kind of situation that we will normally find ourselves in. I mean, more often than not, we do have other brothers and sisters around us who can help us, who want to help us. We do often regularly have other Christians seeking to encourage our hearts. And if that's the case, brethren, we would do well to heed the loving encouragement that comes from your brothers and sisters in Christ. Do not despise their counsel. Certainly do not disregard their attempts to encourage your soul and to lift your soul up. David would have given anything to have Jonathan next to him in this moment. And so if you have in your daily life, as you find yourself in discouragement, if you have other Christians that are there to try to encourage your soul, brethren, don't despise that. Don't disregard that. Because if you do so, you only damage and isolate yourself when we do that kind of thing. But the truth is that whether through actual isolation, like what has happened here with David, or through disregarding the encouragement of other Christians, we can at times find ourselves in a situation where we feel like what David felt like here. We can at times end up feeling like we are all alone and all hope of encouragement is lost. We really can, brethren, feel like we're doomed to be stuck in some kind of devastating despair forever. That's true. That can happen to even the best of Christians. They find themselves in absolute discouragement and despair, and they think they'll never be able to get out of it. But brethren, if David is able to find his way out of this hole that he's in, then brethren, we ought to be able to find our way out too. But still, I guess the question remains, how? Like, how do you do that, right? There's been a lot of talk of me telling you this is something we can do and I want us to do, but the question still remains, how can we do it? So I want to give you some scriptural insights here, some helps, some principles that I think you can apply as we find ourselves in discouragement. But before I do, I want to say a couple of things. I want to tell you very clearly what I am not going to say and what I do not think that you should do. You are not going to hear me say that you just have to get over it, or that if you find yourself in this discouraging hole, that you just got to get out of it. Or as is, the phrase that's so often used, right, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just do better, just be better. I was listening to a message of a guy out in San Antonio recently, and he made this point that, we use that phrase gets used to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But brethren, the fact of the matter is sometimes you feel like your bootstraps are all the way up to the ceiling and you're not going any higher and you're not getting any better. So this is not what I think you ought to do. This is not going to be my counsel to you. Brethren, the reality is a true solution to discouragement and despair is not going to come by you just trying harder. Now, no doubt it does say in our text David strengthened himself in Yahweh his God. But brethren, you don't want to take that to mean that somehow David did this thing all on his own. That somehow he was able to find his way out of this anguish and sorrow by his own power and by his own decision making. Something supernatural happened here. And that's what we need to happen to us when we find ourselves in these situations. Over and over again, brethren, the Bible makes clear that our strength and our endurance and our encouragement when we find ourselves in distress comes from a source that's outside of ourselves. Listen, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. Be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus. It's outside of you. This isn't something you have. You've got to go get it somewhere else. Ephesians 6:10. This is what we read earlier. Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. It's outside of us, brethren. Colossians 1:11 talks about being strengthened with all power according to His glorious might. And of course, you know this text in Philippians chapter 4, where Paul says, I can do all things by my own strength. Is that what Paul says? No. That's not what Paul says. What does Paul say? Through Him who strengthens me, right? Brethren, this comes from the outside. Something supernatural has to happen for us to have strength to endure. Now, with that made clear, let me also say this. Another thing that I'm not going to say. You will not find your way out of any kind of pit of distress or discouragement by simply laying at the bottom of that pit and bemoaning your situation. You're not going to get out by doing that either. So what can be done, right? What can you do as a Christian as you seek to advance your situation while at the same time you're keeping your eyes on the Lord as your only source of strength? What can you do, right? Because He is the true source of strength and help. And yet, what can you do as a Christian to help advance that situation as you look for God's strength and help to come to you? So I want to take us here to Psalm 69. So if you want to turn over there, Psalm 69. And I want us to go here because I think in this psalm, this is a Psalm of David here, and in this psalm, there are some very helpful principles that are embedded in this psalm that, brethren, David used these as he learned and faced affliction. And brethren, these principles, if we can begin to apply them in our lives as we face discouragement or affliction, brethren, they're worth their weight in gold here. Now, I also want to say something else. There is no provable connection between Psalm 69 and the text that we just looked at in 1 Samuel chapter 30. There's no real provable connection between the two. But you will find in Psalm 69 that there are a large number of similarities between what happened in 1 Samuel 30 and what David is writing in Psalm 69. So even if David did not write this psalm in direct response to the events of 1 Samuel 30, I think that we do have to concede that at minimum, what David learned in these events of 1 Samuel 30, they bleed out all over the place in David's psalms, and especially so in this particular psalm. So in Psalm 69, let's just take note here of what's happening. What is David's situation in Psalm 69? Where does David find himself? So let me just read several passages here so that we can see where's David at in this psalm. And you'll see all these connections to 1 Samuel chapter 30. So let's read here starting in verse 1 of Psalm 69. He says, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire, where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I am weary with my crying out. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my God. More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Mighty are those who would destroy me, those who attack me with lies. What did I not steal? Must I now restore? You can see David's, this connection with what's happening in 1 Samuel 30, right? David is in this distressful situation. His heart is heavy. And then he says in verse 20, look at what's down here in verse 20. He says, reproaches have broken my heart so that I am in despair. I looked for pity, but there was none. And for comforters, but I found none. And then in 26 and 27, for they persecute him whom you have struck down, and they recount the pain of those you have wounded. Add to them punishment upon punishment. May they have no acquittal from you. And verse 29, I am afflicted and in pain. Let your salvation, O God, set me on high. So David is clearly, in what he writes in this psalm, David is clearly not doing well. He's clearly in great distress. But brethren, this is not the entire story that this psalm tells. Embedded in this psalm is also a glorious story of a man who finds himself in agony of heart, but he refuses to let that be his end. Now, David may not be able to completely change his situation on his own, but he can take certain steps to try and get his soul right. And these are the things that I want us to consider. David does 4 things in this psalm. And we're going to consider each of them pretty briefly. The first thing, David prays. Now that might seem like an unnecessary point to make, but brother, I don't want us to overlook the importance of it. The second thing is, David finds contentment. He makes peace with the present will of God in his life. David makes peace with what it is that he's dealing with. And brethren, this is vital in the midst of a trial. And then number 3, David comes to God in worship. Brethren, we're going to see how important this is in the role of lifting up your soul. And then number 4, David counsels his soul with truth. So I want us to consider each of these pretty briefly. The first thing is David prays. David prays. Now it's obviously quite evident, isn't it, that David is praying. I mean, the psalm itself is essentially a prayer. But we also find David, very particularly in the psalm, praying. Look at what it says here, starting in verse 16, right? David's praying here. Answer me, O Yahweh, for your steadfast love is good. According to your abundant mercy, turn to me. Hide not your face from your servant, for I am in distress. Make haste to answer me. Draw near to my soul. Redeem me. Ransom me because of my enemies. So David is praying to his God. Now, brethren, listen. Again, I know that this might be able to go without saying, but you cannot overlook the importance of this when it comes to seeing your soul hauled out of the pit of distress or discouragement. Brethren, we have to pray. Because without praying, brethren, you are literally shutting yourself up away from God. And listen, if it's supernatural help that we need, if it's the Spirit of God that we need to come and encourage our souls, you can be sure, brethren, that no such things will come to someone who has shut themselves up away from God. Well, I spoke about this recently in one of our prayer meetings, but you remember that scene, Jesus with his disciples in the garden, and he tells his disciples, go and pray. and they don't pray. They go and they fall asleep. And you remember what it said there. Why did they fall asleep? Because they were sorrowful. Brethren, the disciples don't pray. Their lack of prayer is, brethren, you can't separate these things. Their lack of prayer is directly connected with their abandonment of the Lord just a little bit after that, when they all flee and scatter. Brethren, don't fall asleep in sorrow. Pray. The second thing that David does, David makes peace with the present will of God for him. Notice what he says in verse 13. He says, "But as for me, my prayer is to you, O Yahweh. At an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me in your saving faithfulness." Brethren, this is such an important text. Listen, David, don't get confused here. David is not pleased with his suffering, but he is content to let the Lord work it as the Lord sees fit. He asks God to answer him. He asks God to be his help. But brethren, he recognizes that David has no right to demand God to do something. And he certainly has no right to demand when God must do something. And so we ask God, God, when the time is right, at an acceptable time, help me, deliver me. This is a man who is at peace with God's will for him in the midst of his suffering. And brethren, when we can really look at our situations of suffering or anguish or discouragement or distress, when we can look at these situations, brethren, and when we can really say, Lord, I need you. I need your help. I don't desire to be here, but I also know that you have a purpose in what you're doing here. And I want that purpose to come to completion. I don't want to sidestep it, Lord. Whatever you have in this suffering for me, I want it. I don't want to just go around it. I don't want to put the cheat code in and go around and escape it. I want the good that you purpose to come from this. Brother, we can say that kind of thing. And then we can say to the Lord, so Lord, when the time is right, bring me out. Bring me out of it. When the time is right, fulfill your promise and work this for good and lift up my face again in encouragement. Brethren, when we can do that, when we can look at trials and suffering and discouragement and we can say to the Lord, Lord, I'm not liking it, but I know it's good. And there's something here that I got to get. So Lord, help me to get it. And when the time is right, encourage my heart again. Brother, when we can look at suffering and say that, then we'll get help from the Lord. We will get help from the Lord. The third thing that David does, David, even in his suffering, he still comes to God in worship. Look at what it says here in verses 30 and 31. He says, I will praise the name of God with a song. I will magnify him with thanksgiving. This will please Yahweh more than an ox or a bull with horns and hooves. Brethren, in all of David's distress, he does not abandon his worship. And brethren, this is vital when it comes to dealing with your heart in the midst of discouragement. If you remember in Psalm 73, just a few chapters later, you find a man named Asaph. And Asaph is deeply bothered because he's looking out into the world and he's wrestling with this fact that to him it looks like the wicked prosper and the righteous are persecuted. And Asaph looks out at this and he's looking at this going, this is awful. I don't even know why I'm trying to walk the way I'm walking and live the way I'm living. Serving God is in vain because the wicked prosper and the righteous die. And then, in the middle of that psalm, in Psalm 73, this is what Asaph says. He's looking out at all this confusing stuff in the world. He says, when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then I discerned their end. Brethren, the reality is, going to the house of God will set your soul right. It will. When you find yourself in distress and affliction, one of the greatest things that you can do is exactly what David did here. Offer up to God a song of worship. We were talking with somebody recently, I think it was talking with Q at one of the prayer meetings. Here's Paul in prison for preaching the gospel, shackled in a dungeon somewhere. And what does he do in the Philippian jail? He's singing. I mean, it's like he looks at David and goes, well, David's in suffering. He sings. Let's sing a song, guys. What song should we sing? Anybody got a hymn? And brethren, there's something to that will strengthen your soul. David's situation is ugly in Psalm 69. I mean, he is in such distress here. And he says, I'm going to praise the name of God with a song. What kind of song are you going to sing, David? But he knows that in doing this, his heart will be encouraged. Offer to God a song of worship. Magnify him with thanksgiving. But you read this psalm in Psalm 69 and go, David, what in the world are you about to thank God for? But I bet you he could find something to thank God for. And brother, what I'm telling you is these kinds of things, these acts of worship, where if you find yourself discouraged, you don't abandon worship, you go to God in worship, and you find if it doesn't do something to your heart, if it doesn't do something to your perspective, see if your heart is not brought to see the glory of God and give you cause for encouragement. I guarantee you that it will. Now, the last thing that David does here is he counsels his own soul with truth. Look at this in 32 and 33. At the end of verse 32, he says, you who seek God, let your hearts revive. For Yahweh hears the needy and does not despise his own people who are prisoners. It's like David's preaching to himself. David is telling his weary soul what it needs to do. And brethren, he's not the only one who understood that this is vital. You see it in Psalm 42. Psalm 42 is a psalm of the sons of Korah. And it says there, the question is asked, why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you in turmoil within me? It's like the psalmist in 42 is looking at his soul, asking the question, why are you acting like this? Why are you cast down? Why are you in turmoil? And then he preaches to himself, hope in God, for I shall again praise him. Brethren, when we find ourselves in discouragement, when we find ourselves in distress, sometimes you're going to have to get a little bit schizophrenic and sit your soul down and have a conversation with yourself. And ask yourself, self, why? Soul, why? Why are you this way? Because, brethren, the enemy will try to fill your mind with lies. And you're going to have to preach truth to yourself. You're going to need a real heavy dose of truth when the enemy comes in with lies. What's the lie? If you read this psalm in Psalm 69, David undoubtedly had the enemy come in with lies. If God cared for you, he wouldn't let this happen to you. If God really cared about you, all this suffering that you're enduring, that wouldn't be on your plate. God wouldn't let you feel like that. And David, boom, he hits him right away with truth. Yahweh does hear the needy. He does not despise his own people. David hits himself with truth, brethren. The truth of the Word of God. Because the lies of the enemy are going to come in to discourage you when you're already discouraged and you're already disheartened. And so David comes in and he faces his soul and he preaches truth to himself. Brethren, in these seasons, do not neglect truth from God. We've got to come to the Word and we've got to let it be an encouragement to our souls. Listen to how I love how Paul puts this in Romans chapter 15. You can look at this text because I think this text really sums up what we're trying to say here. Romans 15, verse 4. Here's what he says. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction. Now watch. That through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. Are you hearing that, brethren? Through the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. Brethren, you've got to come to this truth in the Scriptures and let that truth affect your soul so that you could find encouragement. Brethren, this is exactly the reason I'm preaching this text to you. Actually, I guess I've been preaching a bunch of different texts, but the reason I initially went to 1 Samuel 30 is because this is what happened to me about a month ago. I heard the truth from the Word that David strengthened himself in the Lord. I heard that truth, and brethren, I'm telling you, I heard it, and it's like a fire was lit under me. Because I thought, if David can get there, then I can get there. If that can happen with David, in the situation that David's in, then whatever situation I can definitely get there. I can definitely get out of my hole if David could get out of his hole. And it's the truth, brethren, that lights us. We have to have that truth. Counsel yourself with that truth. So, brethren, I leave you with these principles as hopefully a means for you to be able to pursue God in times of distress. Don't ever think, brethren, that you are left without hope. Because there is hope for the people of God. There is hope to be had for the distressed soul. David found it. I have found it. And brethren, God stakes his very character on the fact that you will also find it. So brethren, these principles are vital for us. As you find yourself in discouragement at any point in your life, or being disheartened, or being distressed, or being bogged down, or whatever you want to put in there, brethren, pray. Find a way to be content in the Lord's will for you in that moment. Find a way to make peace with the fact that God is doing something in it. Come to God and worship. And take truth and preach it to yourself. I want to close again with these words here of Isaiah that Sergio read for us. Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah 40, 28 through 31. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Yahweh is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted, but they who wait for Yahweh. Brethren, sometimes you got to wait. Sometimes you just got to wait. You got to wait on the Lord. They who wait for Yahweh shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint.